Hey everyone, today we've got 10 true disturbing stories about camping in the Appalachian wilderness. But before we start, please make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel and you can change your mind later. And if you've got any ideas for what the next video should be, feel free to drop them down in the comments. Jude and I had been planning that backpacking trip for a couple months. We both needed a break. He was burned out from work, and I just wanted to get off the grid for a few days. We picked a stretch of forest near the Virginia-North Carolina line, somewhere along the Blue Ridge. We parked the car in a small gravel turnout and hiked in the first afternoon without any issues. Set up camp near a stream, made a small fire, passed a bottle between us until the stars came out. Honestly, it was exactly the kind of trip we were hoping for. The next morning, we packed up early and headed deeper into the forest. By noon, the trail had turned into more of a suggestion. Just narrow tracks through dense brush, the kind that disappear if you're not paying attention. We didn't mind. That was part of the adventure. We had a compass, topographic maps, and decent weather. No cell signal, but that's kind of the point. Late in the afternoon, we started scouting for a spot to set up camp. That's when we saw the fire. It was barely visible through the trees, just a flicker of orange tucked low on the other side of a slope. No smoke, no sound, just that soft glow. It didn't make sense. We hadn't passed another hiker, not since we left the trailhead the day before. There was no car, no gear stashed off the path, and whoever had built that fire, they hadn't done it in an open clearing. It was hidden. Jude was curious. Thought maybe it was another pair of hikers like us, taking a break. He even joked about stopping by the trade trail mix in ghost stories. But something about it made my neck tense up. It wasn't just unexpected, it felt intentional. Like we weren't supposed to see it. I told Jude to let it be. He didn't argue, but he looked at me a little sideways. I think he was wondering if I was just being overly cautious. Maybe I was. We set up camp a little farther down, off the path near a ridge. Cooked a quick meal, freeze-dried stew, some trail bars, and sat quietly for a while. That's when I saw the figure. It was maybe 30 yards out, right where the trees started to thicken. A person, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement. Nothing that made sense. I blinked, and they were gone. Jude thought I was messing with him at first. Then he shrugged it off. Probably a deer, maybe another camper heading back to their tent. But they weren't carrying a light. They weren't walking. They were watching. I didn't push it. I wasn't even sure what I'd seen. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up to these slow, deliberate crunches outside the tent. Not the quick rustle of a raccoon or deer. Something with weight, moving in a circle. One step, pause, another. It felt measured. By morning, Jude was annoyed. His back hurt from the uneven ground, and he said the air felt heavier than usual. We decided to cut the day short, only hike another mile or so, and make camp early. Just take it easy. The forest was thick there. Mossy, huge trees that blocked out most of the sun, even at noon. Quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful anymore. That's when we found the clothes. They were hanging from a branch maybe 6 feet up. A flannel shirt, jeans, and a pair of socks tied together and knotted around the branch like someone had built a scarecrow and never finished. Everything looked clean. No wear, no tears. Just placed there. Jude laughed, said it was probably a joke, maybe some local kids messing with hikers, but I couldn't shake it. It was too deliberate, too neat. We moved on without touching it, but 20 minutes later, it happened again. Same bundle, same knots. Same branch height, different spot entirely. The slope was off. The terrain was new. We hadn't circled back. I was sure of it. I stopped walking. Told Jude what I was thinking. He looked at the clothes, then at the compass, then back at me. For the first time, he looked nervous. We didn't loop, he said, more to himself than to me. We started walking faster after that. Still no birds, no insects. Just the sound of our boots and our breathing. Then came the rocks. We entered a clearing neither of us remembered approaching. In the center was a ring of stones, small, round, each one no bigger than a fist, arranged perfectly. No scorch marks, no signs of use, just a clean, undisturbed circle, like someone had taken their time placing them. Jude stood there for a moment, just staring. Then he looked at me and said, "All right, this is messed up." We both agreed to turn back. We didn't even debate it. Something wasn't right, and then we saw the man. He was sitting on a downed log right in the middle of the trail, like he'd been waiting. Wearing jeans, a canvas jacket, and a black ball cap pulled low over his eyes. No backpack, no water, nothing. I called out, asked if he needed help. He didn't move. Jude raised his hand in a half wave. The man slowly stood, head still tilted down, and without a word, turned and walked straight into the woods. Didn't brush aside branches. Didn't leave a trail, just disappeared. We waited, watched the spot. Nothing moved, no sound. After 5 minutes, we kept going. Didn't talk, just moved. The woods got weird after that. The landmarks didn't match what we remembered. Tree formations felt wrong, like they'd shifted slightly. The air smelled different, damp and metallic, like old pipes or wet pennies. The stream we'd camped by that first night was gone. We finally found a dry gulch that seemed kind of familiar and decided to stop there. Didn't build a fire. Ate quickly, kept our packs ready. Sometime after midnight, Jude whispered my name, said he saw someone just outside the tree line. I sat up. Sure enough, there was a silhouette, 20 feet away, not moving. No flashlight, just standing there. We didn't wait. We grabbed everything, kept the headlamps off, and started moving fast. Downhill, eastward, anywhere that might lead to a road. By dawn, we stumbled onto a gravel service road. Not on the map, but we didn't care. We followed it for hours until it hit the pavement. First truck that passed, we flagged it down. The guy said we were over 25 miles from where we should have been. Back home, I tried retracing our steps. Nothing matched. That trail, not on any current topo. Even the Forestry Service didn't have a name for that section, said it might be old private land or just unregulated state forest. Jude still won't talk about it. He jokes that it was probably moonshiners or squatters, but he won't look me in the eye when he says it. I was 19 when it happened. Denny, a guy I knew from community college, invited a few of us to go camping out on his family's land in eastern Kentucky. The place had belonged to his grandfather, and nobody had really used it in years. I wasn't big into camping or anything, but I said yes. Mostly because I needed to get away. I'd just come out of this pretty heavy breakup, and my brain was all over the place. There were 5 of us total. Denny, me, a guy named Ben, and 2 others, Kyle and Marcus. We loaded up 2 trucks with all the basics, tents, coolers, a couple fishing rods, firewood, way too many bags of chips. The usual, we're totally prepared for nature kind of vibe. We hit the road late Friday morning, and the farther we drove, the more the scenery shifted from suburban to wild. Houses thinned out. Then the pavement ended. By the time we reached the gravel pull-off Denny had marked, it was getting late in the afternoon. The trail beyond that point was narrow and steep, and after walking a few yards in, it was obvious the trucks wouldn't make it. The ground was uneven, thick with roots and washed out spots. Denny said it was a mile hike from there, and, yeah, it felt like longer, especially hauling gear. The quiet hit me before anything else. Not like peaceful quiet, I mean dead quiet. No cars in the distance, no dogs barking, not even wind through the trees. It was a kind of silence I wasn't used to, like the place had been wrapped in cotton. We set up camp near a bend in the creek, where there was just enough open space to pitch tents and make a fire ring. The water moved slow, real slow, and it smelled clean but earthy, like moss and wet stone. That first night, pretty standard. We cooked hot dogs on sticks, passed around a bottle of whiskey someone brought, and sat up swapping stories. At some point, someone asked about bears. Denny shook his head, said he'd never seen one out there, but he did mention something that stuck with me. There were supposedly old mine shafts nearby, long abandoned, most of them caved in or hidden by brush. He said his uncle used to talk about them, warning kids not to go too far off trail, but Denny had never found one himself. We joked about falling into a mine and disappearing forever, and then moved on to something else. The next morning, after a lazy breakfast and some arguing over who'd forgotten to pack the coffee, 3 of us, me, Ben, and Kyle, decided to go exploring. Marcus wanted to fish, and Denny stayed behind with him. No real plan. We just wanted to stretch our legs and see what was out there beyond the camp. It was the kind of terrain that looks the same in every direction. Thick trees, leafy undergrowth, the occasional rocky outcrop. We tried following the slope upward, figuring it might give us a better view. We'd been hiking maybe half an hour when we found it. It wasn't obvious at first, just a shallow, sunken area, maybe 20 feet across. Not a hole exactly, more like a bowl-shaped dip in the ground, circular and too clean to feel natural. There were no branches inside, no leaves, no signs of animals, just bare dirt and this weird stillness. The air even felt heavier there. Ben picked up a rock and tossed it in. We all waited for the sound of it landing, but it never came. I mean nothing, not even a faint thud. That's when I felt it, this off-kilter pull in my stomach. I stepped closer to the edge, and my legs went weird, like they weren't mine. Shaky, unsteady. And even though I was standing on solid ground, my body swore I was teetering on the edge of a drop, like when you lean too far back in a chair and catch yourself. Then this thought slammed into me, sharp, immediate. Not a whisper, not a hallucination. Just one clear idea, push Ben in. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't anger. I didn't want to hurt him. It was like my brain skipped a beat and filled in the blank with that one action. I even imagined how it would feel. The shove. The silence afterward. I pulled back, literally stepped away like I'd been burned. The second I did, the feeling vanished. The pressure in my chest eased. My balance came back. Whatever had grabbed hold of me, it let go just as fast. I didn't say anything. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I almost shoved you into a possibly bottomless hole because I felt like it? No thanks. We moved on pretty quick after that. Kyle made some joke about how the place gave him the creeps, and none of us disagreed. The hike back was quiet. We didn't find anything else. We didn't really look. That night was different. We were back around the fire, not as chatty this time. Denny hadn't asked much about where we went, and we didn't offer much. At some point, he stood up real slow and just walked away from the fire without a word. At first, we didn't think anything of it. Figured he went to pee or something. But 10 minutes passed, then more. We called out a couple times, and when there was no answer, we grabbed flashlights. I found him standing in the middle of the trail, just standing, not facing the camp, not facing away, more like frozen. His arms were slack at his sides. I called his name, and nothing happened. I stepped closer, asked if he was all right. Finally, he turned and looked at me, eyes glassy. Then he said, "We shouldn't be here." That was it. I asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. He just stared past me for a second like he was watching something come up the trail behind me, then blinked and walked right past me like it never happened. He went back to the fire and sat down like nothing was wrong. No one really said anything after that. We barely slept. I stayed zipped in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening for any weird sound. There weren't any. That was almost worse. In the morning, we asked Denny if he remembered anything. He looked confused, thought we were screwing with him. Said he didn't remember getting up, much less walking into the woods. Swore he'd just fallen asleep and woken up in his tent. None of us pushed it. Everyone packed up pretty fast. No big announcement, just this quiet urgency. Like we all knew we needed to get out, but no one wanted to say why out loud. The hike back to the trucks felt slower, heavier. Maybe it was the gear. Maybe it was just the weird cloud hanging over the group. Then we saw him, a man standing just off the trail. Not walking, just standing between 2 trees. He was dressed in faded overalls and a thick canvas work jacket that looked too clean, too new, like something out of an old photograph. The kind where no one smiles, and the background is always a little too still. He didn't say anything, just watched us. Ben said hi, like it was a reflex. The man nodded once, slow and deliberate, then turned and walked into the woods. No one followed. We didn't even talk about it, just kept walking. When we finally reached the trucks, the whole group moved fast. Threw gear in the back, didn't bother checking if anything was left behind. I asked Denny later if anyone lived nearby. He said the closest house was 5 miles east. He looked sick when he said it. That was 4 years ago. I haven't been camping since, not once. I was 29 when my cousin Elias and I took off for a long weekend in Kershaw Forest, near the southern edge of the Blue Ridge. We'd both grown up not far from there, and honestly, most of our childhood summers were spent hiking those trails. Elias had found this spot on an old forestry map he pulled from a PDF on some backcountry forum. It was beyond the established trails, past where the park rangers even bothered to mow down the brush. We parked the truck next to this rusted-out service gate that looked like it hadn't swung open in decades. It wasn't locked, but the hinges had seized up so bad Elias had to wedge a rock under it to squeeze by. From there, we hiked in with our packs, maybe 3 hours total, though the last stretch was more like wandering. The fire road faded out into nothing, and we had to bushwhack a little until we found a clearing that looked workable. The spot we picked was just past a dense patch of mountain laurel. Flat enough for the tent, soft enough ground, and no obvious animal trails nearby. It felt sealed off, like we were tucked into this little bowl of trees, the kind of silence that wraps around you. Not eerie, just calm. We set up camp, boiled some rice and lentils on a little pocket stove, and turned in early. We planned to do some ridge hiking the next day, maybe scope out a few natural landmarks Elias had read about in a geology forum. But honestly, I was just looking forward to sleeping under trees again. It felt like I hadn't done that in years. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. You know how sometimes your body wakes you before your brain catches up? It was like that. I was still groggy, eyes crusted shut, when I realized I was hearing something soft. Dry leaves, shifting, footsteps. Not animal fast, not chaotic, just slow, steady, barefoot maybe. There was no crunch of boots, no snapping twigs, just the sound of someone or something moving carefully through dead leaves. I sat up quietly and listened. My first thought was a deer, or a coyote maybe, but the steps weren't light or skittish. They were deliberate. They circled once around the tent. No snorting, no sniffing, just a clean, unbroken loop. Then silence. I whispered Elias's name, but he was already up. I could barely make out his face, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring toward the wall of the tent, completely still. Then, slowly, he reached down and pulled the small hatchet from the side pouch of his pack. We didn't speak. Didn't even breathe heavy. Just waited. After a little while, maybe 30 seconds, maybe more, the sound drifted away. No big crashing exit, no retreat through the brush. Just fading. Like whoever or whatever had been there simply backed up into the trees and stopped. We stayed awake for a long time after that. Every sound felt amplified. A pine cone dropping made me jump. When Elias finally spoke, it was just to say he thought it might have been a bear. But even as he said it, he didn't sound convinced. Bears don't walk in slow, perfect circles. And they don't just leave. The next morning, the forest felt normal again. Still quiet, but not heavy. We looked around the perimeter of our site, but there were no tracks. The ground was dry and thick with matted leaves, so that wasn't all that surprising. Still, something about the lack of any sign made the night feel stranger, not less. We talked it through over instant coffee and decided to stay the second night. Maybe it was stupid, but we'd come all this way and there was no real reason to bail. We agreed to hike a little farther up the ridge during the day, just to see more of the terrain. A couple hours in, we found the remains of what looked like a hunting blind, or maybe an old observation stand. It had collapsed in on itself, mostly just a few beams of rotted wood tangled in weeds and spiderwebs. But right in the center of it, sitting on a half-buried board, was a pair of boots. They didn't fit the rest of the scene, not cracked or moldy or filled with leaves, just a clean black pair. rubber soles, no laces, like someone had slipped them off that morning. We both saw them at the same time and stopped walking. Elias asked if they could have been dropped recently, but he already knew the answer. The nearest marked trail was probably 7 or 8 miles out. The fire roads didn't connect to anything active. This wasn't a place you stumbled into. We didn't touch them, didn't go near them, just stood there for a minute and then turned back. That evening, back at camp, neither of us said much. We cooked, sat by the fire, poked at the coals, watched the trees. The bugs had gone quiet again. That's what really got to me. The first night, the forest had been buzzing with the usual summer noise: crickets, distant owls, maybe the occasional frog. But that second night, nothing. Around 10, we heard a branch snap. Just one. Somewhere up the hill behind us. Not big, not showy, just a single dry crack like someone shifting their weight. Then nothing. We doused the fire and got in the tent. Neither of us had to say it out loud. We were done being curious. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up again, but when I did, I knew immediately something was wrong. Breathing. That's what I heard first. Not Elias. This was outside. Close. Shallow, irregular breaths. Like whoever it was, couldn't quite catch a rhythm. I lay still, not even blinking, listening. And then there was a sound, just the faintest brush of something against the tent wall, like fabric dragging across nylon. And then it sat down. I could feel the shift, the weight. Not enough to bend the fabric inward, but close. Too close. I reached out and grabbed Elias's arm. He didn't move. "I hear it," he whispered. We stayed frozen. The breathing kept going, sometimes stopping for long stretches, then starting again. Once or twice, I swear I heard it reposition itself, like knees shifting against dirt. But it never stood up, never moved away. It just stayed there, maybe 2 feet from where we lay, on the other side of a few millimeters of tent fabric. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably less. Eventually, the breathing stopped. No footsteps, no retreat. Just nothing. We waited until the sky started to turn gray. When we finally crawled out, there was no sign of anything. No footprints. No marks. The leaves by the tent hadn't even been disturbed. But the boots, the same black boots we'd seen in the collapsed blind, they were sitting neatly by our dead fire pit, side by side, clean, facing the tent. We didn't say a word, just packed up camp as fast as humanly possible. Everything jammed into our packs in under 15 minutes. We didn't speak until we were back at the truck. That was almost 3 years ago. Elias still hikes, but always on the trail. Always during the day. I was 26 when it happened. My cousin Aaron had been trying to get me to go camping with him for months, somewhere way out in the Appalachians. We drove out early on a Friday. The farther we went, the patchier the roads got, cracked asphalt turning into gravel, then dirt. My phone signal dropped before we even hit the trailhead. When we parked, there was an old wooden marker leaning sideways, the paint so faded you could barely read it. We loaded our packs and hiked for about an hour, maybe a little more. The trail got thinner the farther we went, until it was basically a line through ferns and roots. We found a clearing near a creek that looked perfect. The air had that thick, earthy smell: wet leaves, mud, something faintly metallic like rain that never fell. Aaron set up his tent near the tree line, and I put mine closer to the creek, maybe 15 or 20 feet away. You could hear the water trickling just enough to make conversation soft. We built a small fire, made dinner, and sat talking until the light was gone. It felt normal, just a quiet night in the woods. The kind of silence that makes you realize how much noise you live with every day. The first weird thing was tiny, not even worth mentioning at first. I had unpacked a few old maps, the kind you spread out to get a sense of the terrain. I laid one flat on a rock, used my flashlight and canteen to hold it down. I turned around to grab my bag. Maybe 10 seconds, tops, and when I looked back, the map was gone. The canteen and flashlight hadn't moved an inch. I figured the wind took it, even though there wasn't any breeze. Found it a few minutes later beside my tent, folded exactly how it had been when I first pulled it out. It felt too neat to be an accident, but I brushed it off. That night, after Aaron went to sleep, I went down to the creek to brush my teeth. The moonlight was bright enough that everything was visible in that silvery kind of way, where you can't tell what's shadow and what's not. The water was calm, clear enough that you could see the pebbles under it. When I turned back toward camp, something looked off. My tent seemed farther away than before. Not a huge difference, just enough that I had to blink and double-check my depth perception. It felt like the clearing had stretched. I took a few steps forward, and the sound of the creek dulled, like I was walking through a layer of thick air. It made my ears ring faintly. Then, with one more step, everything snapped back to normal. The sound, the distance, all of it. I stood there for a while trying to figure it out. Eventually, I convinced myself I was tired. The next morning, Aaron was cheerful as ever. He didn't notice anything strange, and I didn't bring it up. We spent most of the day fishing. The creek was full of small trout, and by afternoon, we'd caught enough for dinner. It was one of those easy days where everything feels balanced again. I even started thinking maybe I'd been imagining things the night before. That was before I found the knife. When I went to grab my fillet knife from my pack, it wasn't there. I turned around, and it was standing upright in the dirt beside my tent blade, buried halfway down, perfectly straight. It looked like someone had measured the angle. The ground wasn't soft enough for it to sink like that on its own. I stared at it longer than I'd like to admit. Aaron noticed and asked what I was doing. I just said I must have dropped it earlier. He shrugged, didn't think anything of it. That night, Aaron went to bed early again. I stayed up by the fire, poking at the embers, trying to enjoy the quiet. I started going through my pack again, mostly just habit, making sure I knew where everything was. Everything seemed fine until I realized my compass was gone. I checked every pocket, every pouch. It wasn't there. When I looked up, I saw it hanging from a low branch right above my tent. The cord looped neatly around it, the needle glinting in the firelight. It was swinging slightly, like it had just been placed there. I got up and reached for it. The bark of the tree was warm, not from the fire too far for that. It was a deep warmth, like something was alive under the surface. That was enough for me. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay flat, listening to the quiet. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up. No idea why. The fire was dead. The air had that heavy, muffled feeling, like right before a storm, except the sky was clear. I could hear the slow trickle of the creek and nothing else. Through the mesh of the tent, I saw Aaron's lantern glowing faintly. Then there was movement, something gliding past his tent. It didn't move like a person. It was too smooth, almost like someone sliding on ice, stopping and starting in short, even bursts. I whispered Aaron's name once, but he didn't answer. The movement kept going. Then it stopped. The woods went completely silent. Even the creek sounded distant. A moment later, I heard footsteps behind my tent, soft, deliberate, crushing leaves one by one. I held my breath. The steps didn't come closer. They moved sideways, circling slowly, stopping every few seconds. I could feel the vibration through the ground. I waited, staring at the tent wall, trying to see a shadow, anything. After what felt like forever, I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and stepped out. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The clearing looked normal. Aaron's tent was zipped up. His lantern was off now, but something had changed. All of our gear, every bag, pan, rope, cooler, was lined up in a straight row stretching from my tent to the creek. Every single item facing the same direction. I woke Aaron up. He saw the line of gear and went pale. We didn't argue or waste time. We just packed what we could and left. We hiked out under our headlamps, following what we thought was the trail. Every few minutes I checked the compass, but the needle wouldn't stop spinning. It just turned in slow circles, no matter which way I faced. Aaron used his phone's GPS to get us back. When we finally reached the road and the truck came into view, I looked down again. The needle had stopped spinning. It was pointing straight back toward the forest we'd just left. I tossed the compass into the woods as soon as we were in the truck. We didn't say much on the drive home. After that, I never brought that trip up. I'd gone camping alone near the southern edge of the Appalachians, not far from a small town called Hollow Bend. When I mentioned the trail I was planning to hike, a few of them frowned. One man behind the counter at a gas station said, "That old path's been shut down for safety." He said it casually, like small talk, but the way he didn't look me in the eye stuck with me. My job back then was all screens and deadlines, and my apartment sat right above a noisy bar that never seemed to close. A quiet weekend outdoors sounded like exactly what I needed. I parked my truck by a rusted gate that hung sideways off its hinges. Beyond it, the road turned into a rocky track, barely visible under dead leaves. I walked about 2 miles in, following the faint outline of what must have been the old trail. The forest was thick, but the ground near a small creek was flat enough to set up camp. The air smelled clean, and the only sound was the slow, steady rush of water over rocks. I pitched my tent, gathered a bit of firewood, settled in. Nothing about the place felt dangerous, just forgotten. That first evening was quiet in a comforting way. I heated up a can of soup, watched the flames lick at the pot, and listened to the fire crackle. I turned in early, lying there with the low hum of crickets outside. Sometime after midnight, I woke up, not because of a sound, but because of the absence of one. It was silent completely, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like a missing piece in a familiar song. No insects, no wind through the trees, no creek. I reached for my phone to check the time, but the screen stayed black. The phone wasn't dead, it just wouldn't light up. I pressed the button a few more times, even held it near the flashlight, but nothing changed. I gave up and told myself it was a glitch. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though I don't remember when. When I woke up the next morning, the tent zipper was open halfway. My first thought was that I'd done it myself and forgotten. But then I noticed my gear looked different. My water bottle was standing upright beside the fire pit, and my boots were sitting neatly side by side outside the tent. I always kicked them off in a heap. I told myself it was fine. Maybe I'd been half asleep and didn't remember. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I made coffee on the camp stove and decided to hike farther down the trail. It started off clear enough but got thinner and rougher the deeper I went. After about an hour, the path narrowed to what looked more like an animal trail. I was about to turn back when I noticed footprints in the soft dirt ahead of me, boot prints, but small. They looked like they belonged to a child, though the stride was long and uneven, as if whoever made them had been moving awkwardly. The prints went straight ahead for maybe 10 feet, then stopped near a fallen tree. No sign of where they went next. I looked around for broken branches or scuff marks, but saw nothing. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing unusual, just the faint rustle of leaves somewhere far off. Still, something about it unsettled me. I turned back before the light started to fade. It took me longer to get back than it had to get out there. The woods seemed different on the return, quieter, darker. By the time I reached camp, the sky had gone dusky blue. My tent was zipped up tight, but the fire pit had been restacked. The old burned wood was gone, replaced by fresh sticks and snapped branches arranged neatly like someone had prepared it for me. I hadn't done that. That night, I couldn't relax. I lay in the tent listening to the faint shifting of air outside. Every so often, something brushed softly against the nylon. Just a whisper of contact, enough to make me freeze. I kept telling myself it was an animal nosing around. I even tried to picture a raccoon rummaging through my pack, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and I never heard the sound of anything walking away. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. At first sign of dawn, I made up my mind to leave. I packed quickly, not caring how messy it looked. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my stomach dropped. My own footprints from yesterday were gone, completely. The ground was smooth except for one thing. Circling the tent were dozens of small prints, the same shape and size as the ones I'd seen by the fallen tree. They overlapped each other in every direction, as if someone had walked loops around me for hours. Some were pressed deep, others faint, like the ground had been disturbed again and again. I stuffed the rest of my gear into my pack without looking too closely at anything. The woods felt heavier now. Not quiet, not loud, just aware. As I made my way back, the sounds of the forest returned, birds calling, leaves rustling, but instead of comforting me, they made my skin prickle. Every sound felt pointed, like the woods were performing normal for my benefit. About halfway back, I saw something new. A wooden sign nailed to a tree I didn't remember passing before. The wood was gray and rough, the edges splintered with age. The letters looked hand-carved, uneven but deliberate. No return past sundown. I stood there staring at it for a long time. It didn't look freshly made, but I knew it hadn't been there yesterday. I walked faster after that. When the truck came into view through the trees, I felt a rush of relief so strong it made my knees weak. But the feeling didn't last. I reached into my pocket for my keys, and they weren't there. I checked the other pocket, then the bag, then dumped everything onto the ground. Nothing. I was seconds from tearing the seats apart when I remembered the sleeping bag. I unrolled it, and there they were. My keys, wrapped tight inside, like someone had taken the time to fold them in. I drove straight back to Hollow Bend without stopping. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep them on the wheel. When I reached the gas station, the same man who'd warned me about the trail was behind the counter. I wanted to tell him what happened, but the words caught somewhere in my throat. I just bought a bottle of water and left. Back home, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were kids from town messing around, or someone living out there who didn't want company. That explanation didn't make much sense, but it was better than thinking about the other possibilities. I looked up that area online. There was nothing. No trail name, no mention of a closure, nothing on maps or hiking forums. When I checked the satellite view, it just showed a stretch of unbroken forest. My cousin Mason and I had been talking for months about taking a few days off to get away from everything. We both worked jobs that kept us indoors too long, staring at screens and pretending not to notice the clock. So when he found a map online showing a small, unmarked clearing somewhere deep in the Blue Ridge Range, we figured it was perfect. We drove out there on a Thursday afternoon in early fall. The air was cool but not cold, just that crisp kind of temperature that makes you breathe deeper. As the road thinned to gravel and our phones lost signal, Mason laughed and said it was a proper disconnect. I remember thinking that if we broke down out there, no one would even know where to start looking. But I didn't say that out loud. We got to the clearing just before sunset. The light was low and gold between the trees, and everything looked still, almost staged. We pitched the tent, unpacked the cooler, and walked down to the creek to fill our bottles. The water was shallow but clear, and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and iron. A few crickets chirped, but otherwise the woods felt quiet in that heavy, listening kind of way. Every sound seemed to travel farther than it should have, even our footsteps. While we were eating, I heard what sounded like branches cracking somewhere up the ridge. Not loud, just spaced out, deliberate. Mason said it was probably a deer or maybe a black bear nosing around. I nodded, trying to believe that. We talked a bit more about nothing in particular, tossed the scraps into the fire, and called it a night around 10. The quiet that followed was almost total, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to this slow, deliberate noise. It wasn't the wind or some random rustle, it was movement. Steady. Heavy. Like someone walking in a slow circle through dry leaves. I held my breath and listened. The sound made one full lap around our tent, pausing every few steps. Then it stopped right near the flap. For a long time, there was nothing. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I counted 10 seconds, 20, a full minute, and still nothing moved. I finally reached out, unzipped the flap just enough to peek through. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to ash, glowing faintly, but the ground outside looked strange, like the soil had been disturbed. It was darker, softer, almost like someone had dug a shallow line around us. I told myself it was just shadow or moisture and zipped the tent back up. When the sun came up, everything looked normal again, almost too normal. Mason was already making coffee when I spotted it, a little stack of stones near the creek, about 6 inches high, perfectly balanced. 3 flat rocks, 1 small rounded one on top. I pointed it out. Mason shrugged and said, maybe it was there before, but I knew it wasn't. The dirt underneath was dry while everything else was still damp with dew. We broke it apart, spread the stones out, and moved on. That day was quiet. We hiked a bit, cooked lunch, took turns dozing in the sun, but something about the place felt off. The woods had that subtle kind of wrongness you only notice after being still for too long. When I listened, it sounded like the creek had moved farther away, though I knew our tent hadn't budged an inch. Even the slope of the clearing seemed different, like it tilted a little more toward the trees than before. That night, neither of us slept easily. Around midnight, Mason got up to pee and came back saying the creek looked strange. I went with him to check, and sure enough, the water was barely moving. Just a thin trickle now, glinting faintly in the dark. We followed it upstream, thinking maybe it had gotten blocked by fallen branches or a landslide. But after a short walk, the bank suddenly dropped into a steep cut of red dirt. It was fresh, raw, like the ground had split recently. I didn't remember seeing anything like that before. When we made it back to camp, the rocks were stacked again. Same shape, same neat little tower. We argued for a while. Mason thought I was messing with him. I told him if I were going to pull a prank, I'd do something better than restack rocks. The whole thing turned sour after that. We decided to leave in the morning. Mason went to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't catch. Everything else worked, the lights, the radio, but the engine just clicked uselessly. He swore under his breath and checked the battery. Perfectly fine. We tried again and again. Nothing. Nothing. By then, it was getting dark, so we gave up and sat by the fire. Neither of us said much. The woods felt closer somehow, like the trees were leaning in. I tried not to look past the glow of the firelight. Somewhere around midnight, Mason froze. He was staring past me toward the trees. I turned and saw something crouched just beyond the light. At first, I thought it was a bear, but it was too still, too human. It shifted once, slow, awkward, like balancing on uneven ground, and then straightened up. My first instinct was to grab the flashlight, but when I clicked it, nothing happened. Dead batteries. Mason's hand hovered near his pack, not moving. We both sat there, breathing shallow, watching this shape barely move at the edge of the firelight. It didn't come closer. It just swayed side to side like it was waiting for us to blink. Then, after a few long minutes, it backed away. No footsteps. Just the faint slide of soil collapsing beneath it, as if the ground itself was shifting to make space. We didn't sleep. We just sat there until the first light touched the trees. When Mason turned the key that morning, the truck started like nothing had ever been wrong. Neither of us said a word while we packed. We drove until we reached a small gas station an hour away, both of us pretending nothing had happened. While I filled the tank, Mason opened the cooler to grab a bottle of water. He stopped. Inside the lid, there was a wet streak of mud, dark red-brown, like clay, and stuck to it were tiny gray stones, smooth and round, just like the ones from that little pile. He wiped it once with a towel, but the mud smeared instead of coming off clean. We didn't talk about it. We just drove. I didn't camp again for years after that. Even the thought of sleeping outdoors made my stomach tighten. I kept telling myself we'd just run into some kind of weird soil shift, that the noises and the figure had a normal explanation. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself thinking about how the ground kept changing shape, how the creek disappeared, how the air went still before anything strange happened. A few months later, I finally gave in and looked the place up. The coordinates Mason had saved led me to a historical article about the old ranger station nearby. It had burned down in the 70s. The cleanup crew reported finding several unmarked graves along the slope. Early settlers, probably families that lived close to the land. I'd taken a few days off work and driven deep into the Appalachian foothills, where an old logging trail wound through the ridge and disappeared into the trees. My pack sat a few feet away while I worked. I'd just finished trimming a couple of roots, and set my hatchet, small, wooden-handled, the kind you buy from a hardware store that still smells faintly of oil, right on top of the pack. I remember because I told myself out loud not to lose it. A few minutes later, when I reached for it again, it was gone. At first, I figured I'd kicked it downhill. The slope behind my tent was short but steep, so I scanned the area, brushed away some leaves, and circled the tent twice. Then I saw it, my hatchet leaning perfectly upright against a tree behind me, blade down, handle resting on the bark like someone had placed it there gently. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for some memory to kick in, some logical reason it could have ended up there. Nothing. I picked it up, told myself I must have spaced out, and went back to work. The rest of the day passed quietly. I gathered small logs, stacked them by length, and built a little fire ring from the stones near the creek bed. The trail curved behind my camp, so anyone walking through would have had to crunch over loose gravel, but the forest stayed still. I liked that. When I finished, I made a simple meal rice and dried vegetables and ate sitting on an old stump I dragged over. It was peaceful in that stripped-down way only the woods can be. Before going to bed, I checked my gear again. Everything looked fine. The hatchet was exactly where I left it, on top of the pack. I zipped myself into the tent and fell asleep faster than I expected. Sometime later, I woke up with the strange feeling that something about the layout of the camp had changed. It wasn't a sound that woke me. No animal noises, no footsteps, nothing. I just knew something was off. The tent felt tilted, like the ground underneath had subtly shifted. I unzipped the flap and stepped out barefoot. The fire was nearly dead, just a faint orange glow in the ashes. My pack was now on the opposite side of the tent from where I'd put it. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'd moved it before lying down and forgotten. Maybe I was half asleep. I picked it up, set it back where it belonged, and went inside again. Morning light cut through the trees when I finally got up for good. I made coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to hike to a nearby overlook a few miles up the ridge. I left most of my gear behind since the trail was narrow and rocky. Everything seemed normal again. When I returned before noon, I spotted the tent flap hanging open. I froze for a second. The zipper wasn't broken, just unzipped cleanly. Inside, everything looked arranged. My sleeping bag had been pulled out and laid neatly on the ground, perfectly straight. My small stove sat next to it, turned upside down. Nothing was missing. Nothing was even dirty. It was like someone had gone through my stuff just to let me know they could. I searched for footprints, but the ground was covered in leaves, and the soil was too soft to hold any clear marks. I walked the whole perimeter, scanning between trees, checking the path behind the camp. Not a single stone was out of place. I thought about leaving then, but honestly, it didn't feel dangerous. It just didn't make sense. I told myself some hiker must have stumbled across my camp, gotten curious, and decided to mess with me. That didn't explain why my food and supplies were untouched, but I didn't feel like chasing ghosts. I spent the rest of the afternoon keeping close to the fire ring, stacking wood, fiddling with the stove, anything to stay busy. Every so often, I glanced toward the trees. Nothing moved. The air was still, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. When dusk came, I ate quietly, then tightened every strap and rope around the tent again, just in case. That night, I woke up to the feeling of pressure against my shoulder, like the ground beneath me was lifting slightly. It was quick, one gentle nudge, then gone. I didn't move for a while. I listened for wind, for rustling, for anything. All I heard was my pulse. I reached under my sleeping bag to feel the dirt. It was perfectly flat. When morning came, I saw that the tent had rotated slightly. Not a lot, just a few inches, but enough that one corner now pointed directly at the trail. The stakes were still tight. The ropes were still knotted. Somehow the whole tent had shifted without disturbing anything around it. That was it for me. I decided I wasn't spending another night there. I started breaking down camp right away, folding the tent, packing everything as neatly and quickly as I could. When I went to roll up my sleeping bag, I spotted the hatchet again, this time embedded in the dirt at the edge of camp, handle pointing toward the trail like an arrow. I hadn't touched it since the first day, I pulled it free, wiped the dirt from the blade, and shoved it deep into my pack. Then I slung the pack over my shoulders and started walking down the logging trail. About half a mile later, I stopped to adjust the straps and turned around to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. My hatchet sat in the middle of the trail behind me. Same worn handle, same chipped blade, same small nick near the top, but I knew I had mine. I just checked. It was zipped in my pack. I didn't touch it. I didn't even walk closer. I just picked up my pack again, tightened the straps, and kept moving. I didn't run, but I walked fast enough that my heart pounded in my ears. No footsteps followed. No sound of anything breaking through the trees. Just that steady, heavy silence again. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked miles away near the start of the trail. I threw everything inside, locked the doors, and drove until the forest gave way to small towns and cell service returned. When I got home, I unpacked everything slowly. My hatchet was still there, exactly where I'd put it in my pack. I checked it over, matching every scratch, every dent. It was mine, no question, but I can still picture that second one on the trail, identical in every detail, waiting in the dirt like a message. Since that trip, I haven't gone camping alone again. I still love the woods, but now I stay in campgrounds where other people are nearby. I was on a short solo trip somewhere along the lower stretch of the Blue Ridge, far enough from any main campsite that I could get some quiet but close enough to a public trail that I didn't feel completely isolated. The place seemed perfect. I wedged my pack under a fallen log, sorted through my gear, and made sure I could see the faint track that led back up toward the ridgeline. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. The first couple of hours passed quietly, except for these small sounds in the brush that I kept trying not to notice. I told myself it was the wind slipping through the branches, but it didn't sound like wind. I've camped alone plenty of times, and every forest has its own soundtrack, but something about those pauses between sounds kept getting under my skin. Before it got dark, I walked around the clearing to get familiar with the area. That's something I always do, just to have a mental map in case I need to move fast or find the way back in low light. A narrow game trail curved away from my spot, barely noticeable, twisting around a cluster of boulders before dipping out of sight. When I stepped back into camp, my pack wasn't where I'd left it. It was still under the same log but tilted upright, leaning neatly against the bark instead of lying flat. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd adjusted it earlier, but I couldn't recall doing it. Maybe I had. Maybe I hadn't. I decided it didn't matter, though I caught myself checking it again every few minutes while I cooked. Once the sun went down, the noises came back sharper this time. Not the scatter of wind or small animals, but slow, deliberate pacing. The steps circled from the direction of that faint trail, around the outer edge of my clearing, then stopped completely. The pattern repeated twice before fading away. I turned my flashlight toward the sound more than once, but the beam hit nothing but bark and empty air. I told myself I was overthinking, tried to eat, and stayed calm. By the time I crawled into my tent, the forest was dead quiet again. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a thud. It wasn't loud, just solid. A weighty sound, like something dropping once onto packed earth. I sat perfectly still, my hand frozen halfway toward my light. A few seconds passed. Another thud. Then another, steady and evenly spaced. My brain tried to make it into something ordinary, a branch falling maybe. But branches don't fall in rhythm. I finally grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap an inch. The clearing looked normal. My pack, boots, and pot were exactly where they'd been. The air felt too still, like even the crickets had stopped to listen. I stepped outside, my breath sounding too loud in the quiet. I walked around the edge of my camp, shining the light low across the dirt. Everything was smooth except for one long, thin line near the boulders. It looked like something heavy had been dragged, maybe a yard, then lifted away. No footprints, no sign of what caused it. Just that one mark, cutting through the soft soil. I stared at it for a long time, then shook my head and forced a laugh that didn't sound natural. When I got back to my tent, My cooking pot was sitting in the middle of my sleeping mat. I just stopped and stared at it for a full 10 seconds. I'd left it outside to dry. My tent zipper was still closed, everything sealed tight. I checked every seam, every flap, no openings. It didn't make sense. I told myself maybe I'd brought it in without realizing, though how you forget something like that, I don't know. I carried it back out, set it beside the fire ring, zipped myself in again, and laid down, fully awake but pretending I could sleep. It must have been maybe an hour later when I heard a knock on the tent. Just one. Firm, close, right around knee height. I froze, holding my breath. Another knock came, a few inches to the left. I turned on my flashlight and ripped the zipper open in one quick motion, ready to catch whoever was messing with me. The clearing was empty, completely still. My pot, though, was gone again. I swept the bean toward the boulders, and there it was, sitting upright at the mouth of that faint game trail. My pulse was so loud in my ears I could barely hear anything else. I didn't move toward it. I backed slowly into the tent, zipped up, and sat there with the light in my lap until my hands started to ache from gripping it. Then came the sound above me, a soft scrape, like something adjusting its weight on a branch. I stepped out again, light aimed upward, scanning every limb I could see. Nothing moved, no sway, no rustle, no animal eyes reflecting back. The trees looked like they were holding their breath. I decided right then I'd be gone at first light. I'd deal with tired legs if it meant getting back to the trail early. At some point, I drifted into a half sleep. That's when I heard the murmuring. It wasn't speech exactly, just low tones, uneven and restless, like someone thinking out loud. It came from the direction of the game trail again. I lay still, counting the beats between each sound, my fingers tight around the flashlight. Finally, I couldn't take it. I unzipped the flap, stepped out, and walked straight toward the sound. The second my light touched the boulders, the murmuring stopped. The silence was sudden, too sudden, like whoever had been making it wanted me to know they were aware I was listening. I waited for a full minute, staring into the trees. Nothing moved. When I turned back toward the tent, my boots weren't beside the entrance anymore. They were sitting neatly on top of the fallen log I'd been using as a seat earlier, toes lined up perfectly. I hadn't touched them. That small detail, the neatness of it, hit harder than anything else. That's when I decided I was done. I pulled the boots on, grabbed my canteen and flashlight, and left everything else behind. I figured I could come back for it later. Before I turned to go, I swung the light toward the boulders one last time. Another dragging line had appeared in the dirt longer than the first, cutting straight from the game trail toward my camp. It stopped just a few feet short of where I'd been sleeping. No tracks, no prints, just that mark. As I walked down the main trail, I kept hearing soft shifts behind me, weight moving, slow, deliberate. It didn't sound like footsteps, more like something gliding just out of sync with my pace. Every few minutes, the sound would come again, always the same distance away. Never closer, never farther. I didn't look back. I focused on keeping my flashlight steady and my pace even, though my chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath for miles. After what felt like an hour, I reached the small wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The second I stepped onto it, the sound behind me stopped completely. I turned the flashlight around, finally ready to face whatever it was, and saw nothing. Nothing but the dirt trail leading back into the trees, except there, right at the bridge's edge, was the dragging line again, ending abruptly as if whatever had made it refused to cross. I didn't wait to think about it. I crossed the bridge and picked up my pace until I started to recognize the markers near the parking area. The forest stayed silent the whole way down, too silent. By the time I reached my car, dawn light was just beginning to spill through the trees. I didn't look back at the trailhead. I just got in, turned the key, and drove straight to the ranger station. When I told the ranger I'd left my campsite early and needed help retrieving my gear, he didn't ask why. Maybe I looked as bad as I felt. He came with me later that morning. My tent was still standing, untouched. The ranger walked ahead while I gathered my things. He was quiet, calm. Then he stopped near the boulders and called me over. I saw it before he even said a word, a new dragging line, deeper and longer than before, cutting behind the rocks and disappearing into the brush beyond the ridge. He studied it for a while, then looked at me and said, "Might be best if you camp somewhere else next time." I nodded. I didn't say anything. I just packed up the rest of my things and followed him back down the trail. That was the last time I ever camped alone in that part of the Blue Ridge. Every fall, right after the leaves started to turn that dull orange and the air got that dry, smoky smell, my friends and I would head down to the Monongahela for a weekend of camping. We'd done it 4 years in a row, always around the same week. That year, it was supposed to be me, Mark, and Jesse. But Jesse's wife had just had their baby, so he texted last minute that he couldn't make it. We gave him some good-natured grief, then shrugged it off. Just me and Mark, 2 tents, 3 days, and enough beer for at least twice that. We got there early in the afternoon and parked the truck where the gravel gave up and the moss took over. The rest was a slow hike through tight, twisting trails with our packs digging into our shoulders and the cooler swinging awkwardly between us. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The air felt thicker somehow, like the forest was closing in a bit. I remember thinking the trail looked narrower than last year, like it was adjusting itself. It sounds weird to say now, but at the time it just felt like one of those small, natural shifts you don't question. Our campsite was still there, a flat clearing past a ridge, marked by the ring of stones we'd built on our first trip. We unpacked, cleared some brush, and got the fire pit ready again. I set up my tent near the slope like I always did, a little raised and close to the trees. Mark set his up on the other side, facing mine. We fell into the same rhythm as every other trip: unpack, collect firewood, open a couple beers, and let the world shrink to the circle of light around the fire. The first night was good. Calm. We sat up late talking about dumb stuff, old roommates, bad jobs, how Jesse's kid probably had more hair than he did. By the time the fire started dying down, the cold had crept in, so we called it and turned in early. I woke around 3, needing to pee. The fire was still faintly glowing, just a few coals breathing out heat. I stepped out barefoot, the ground freezing under me, and walked to the edge of the slope. While I was standing there, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker, like motion where there shouldn't have been any, not a light, just a sense of movement. I turned, squinting into the dark, but everything was still, just trees and that faint orange haze from the coals. On the way back, my foot hit something soft but firm, like a duffel bag left out. I crouched, patted the ground, and found nothing. No bag, no bump, no indentation in the pine needles. The earth was smooth, undisturbed. I remember standing there for a few seconds, staring between our 2 tents, trying to figure out what I'd tripped on. Something about the space felt wrong, like the angle had shifted or the distance was off. I told myself it was just the dark playing tricks, crawled back inside, and forced myself to sleep. In the morning, Mark asked if I'd moved the cooler. I hadn't. It was supposed to be beside the fire pit, strapped under the little folding table we used for cooking. We found it sitting about 10 feet away, upright and perfectly untouched, in the middle of a bright patch of sunlight. Thing was, there shouldn't have been sunlight there yet. The trees were too dense. We both looked up, expecting to find a hole in the canopy, but it was solid green. Even when clouds rolled over, the light didn't change. It just stayed fixed, like a spotlight. Mark shrugged it off, and I laughed, but neither of us liked it. We carried the cooler back and didn't say another word about it. By midday, we went our separate ways for a few hours like we usually did. He liked to wander down toward the stream to fish, and I stayed behind to collect kindling and read. It was quiet, peaceful in that slow, heavy way forests get when the air's dry and still. When I came back, maybe 2 hours later, there was another fire ring behind my tent, smaller, neater, made of perfect black stones. No scorch marks, no ash, no disturbance around it. Just a clean circle. I crouched beside it and ran a hand over the stones. They were cold, dry, and looked new, like they hadn't been there yesterday. I waited for Mark to get back before saying anything. He returned close to sunset, carrying a string of small trout, grinning like he'd just beaten the world's hardest game of patience. I asked if he'd built the new ring. His smile dropped immediately. He looked at it, then at me, and said quietly, "Don't use it," that was all. No explanation, no jokes. We just sat by the main fire that night, both pretending not to notice the other circle behind us. I barely slept. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no rustling, not even distant crickets. It was the kind of silence that hums in your ears, like pressure before a storm. Every time I turned over, the tent felt wrong. It was subtle, but I could swear the zipper wasn't where it had been. At one point, I unzipped the flap and looked out, expecting to see the slope in front of me, but it was behind me instead. My tent had turned. There was no sound, no drag marks, nothing. It was just facing another direction. When I woke again around 3, I saw the prints. Small boot prints in the dirt, circling my tent, then marks, then leading straight to that second fire ring. Not ours. Not fresh enough to be muddy, but clear enough to see the tread. They ended right there, no trail leading away. I shook Mark awake. He came out, half asleep, until I pointed to the prints. Then he was wide awake, flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. We checked everything. The food, our bags, the cooler, but nothing was touched. The only difference was Mark's tent. It had shifted too, just slightly, like it had rotated to face that fake ring. We sat up until dawn, boots on, watching the dark. Nothing moved. The fire burned down to ash, and still, we didn't sleep. Morning came pale and colorless. When I went to unzip my tent, something caught in the flap. It was a little stick figure made from twigs tied together with thin, dried string, about the size of my hand. It was wedged into the zipper like someone had left it there deliberately. Mark found one too, tangled in his fishing line. We burned them both in the real fire pit, watched them crumble into black dust, and when we turned to check the second fire ring, it was gone. Not disturbed. Gone. The ground was smooth, covered with fresh pine needles that hadn't been there before. We packed up that afternoon without saying much. On the way back, I noticed the trees looked wrong. The bark where we'd carved our initials years ago was smooth again. The marks were gone, like the forest had healed itself. Even the light looked different, sharp and pale. When we reached the truck, it was still there, but it looked like it had been sitting for weeks instead of 2 nights. A thin film of dirt clung to the tires. Mark brushed it off with his boot, then looked at me and said, "Let's just go." We didn't talk again until we hit pavement. I haven't camped since. I tried to find that area on a map later, but it's not there anymore. When I zoom in on the satellite view, the screen glitches out. A low-res gray patch that never loads properly. My cousin Nolan had just bought this janky old RV off a guy who clearly hadn't done a single oil change in 10 years. But he was excited like he'd won the lottery. He kept calling it the Beast, and somehow that made it feel more reliable. It wasn't. But we were in that early spring lull where nothing sounds better than getting out into the quiet for a couple of days, and Nolan had been bugging me for weeks, so I said yes. We ended up on a ridge just off a narrow turnout near Hollow Creek, squeezed the RV in sideways where the road barely widened. It wasn't a real campground, just a flattish spot between trees, but it felt remote in a good way. No one else around, and the air still had that early season crispness that makes you feel like you're ahead of the crowds. The plan was pretty laid back. Nolan was going to fish and mess around flying his drone around the dam, and I was going to take a solo loop trail that started a little ways down from where we parked. I brought a printed trail map, my phone, a hydration pack, and my old sketchbook that I used whenever I saw something interesting. I've always liked drawing more than taking photos. It helps me notice the weird details. I set out a little after 10. Weather was decent, trail was clear. Nothing special at first, just your typical switchbacks, patches of moss, a squirrel or two, daring me to trip over them. Then I passed these old cabins, just sagging walls and collapsed roofs at this point. And about 10 minutes later, I came across a wooden sign nailed to a leaning tree. It read, Trace 9. Didn't match anything on my printed map. I even double-checked. There was a Trail 7, a Trail 11, A trace ridge something or other, but no trace 9. I took a photo of it anyway, kind of amused, and figured someone was having fun with leftover signage. The trail looked legit, clearly used, so I kept going. I stopped about halfway up the ridge to eat a granola bar and sketch this rusted-out kettle I found wedged weirdly in a tree fork. It was just one of those things that felt like it had been there forever, like the tree had grown around it. There was also this faint sound of water like a creek nearby, but I never saw it. I made a little note of that in the margins. When I got moving again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Boot prints on the trail behind me. They were deep, fresh-looking, and they pointed in the same direction I was headed. I hadn't passed anyone, no one had passed me. And I definitely would have noticed. I'd been stopping constantly to sketch, sip water, adjust my socks. I paused and looked around. Woods were quiet, still, not in a creepy way, just the usual isolated kind of quiet you expect out there. I figured maybe someone had cut in from a side trail I hadn't noticed. Or maybe I'd zoned out and missed them. I kept walking. Another mile or so up, the trail opened into a clearing with this old shelter. It had no roof left, just 4 wooden posts, and what looked like part of a bench slowly collapsing in the middle. I tried checking my phone, no signal, but I dropped a pin on my GPS app just to mark it for fun. Then I went to sketch the shelter, reached for my notebook, and realized it was gone. Checked my bag, my jacket, the ground. Retraced my steps, maybe 20 yards in each direction. Nothing. I even stood perfectly still for a second and yelled out Nolan's name, half-jokingly, like maybe he'd popped out of the woods to mess with me. No reply, of course. I tried calling him anyway. Call failed. Annoyed but not really worried, I turned back the way I came. I figured I must have dropped it at that last stop near the kettle tree. I was paying more attention to the sketch than my bag when I left. But about 10 minutes in, I hit a fork in the trail. That stopped me cold. There were no forks on the map. I checked it again, even unfolded it all the way like that was going to make a secret path appear. But nothing. Both directions looked equally traveled. No obvious clues. I took the right fork, hoping it curved back toward the ridge. And there it was, my notebook, sitting upright in the middle of the path, not dropped or tossed placed. My name was still scrawled across the cover, and that same dirty smudge was there on the corner. But the weirdest part, it was open, not to a sketch page either. Just a single line of text, written in handwriting that looked like mine, traced 9. You came back. The rest of the pages were still blank. I held it for a while. I remember that specifically, how heavy it suddenly felt. I tore the page out, folded it without thinking, and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. I don't know why I didn't turn around then. I should have, but I didn't. Maybe 15, 20 minutes later, I passed the kettle in the tree again, the exact same one. And that's when everything clicked. I looked down and saw my own boot prints again, side by side, 2 sets now, forward and back. Mine. Only, I hadn't come this way twice. I'd turned around once. It didn't make sense. I sat down on a rock and tried to logic my way out of it. Trail must loop. I missed something on the map. Maybe I was dehydrated, though I hadn't felt off until that moment. But nothing added up. That kettle wasn't common. You don't see trees swallowing metal every day. I had drawn it. I knew it was the same one. I pulled my phone out again, opened the GPS app. The pen I dropped earlier was gone. The map was empty, not even the usual background grid, just blank. I restarted the app. When it came back up, a new marker had appeared. Trace 9 start. Blinking red. I hadn't dropped that pen. I turned around again. Things started getting weird. The broken twig I'd stepped on earlier was upright again. My half-buried water bottle was now clean and sitting on a flat rock. The tree where I'd brushed my arm and left a tiny scrape on the bark looked untouched. Even the prints behind me had vanished. It was like something, or someone, was tidying up behind me, erasing signs I'd ever been there, or maybe trying to convince me I hadn't. I finally got back to the clearing with the shelter. Same 4 posts, same caved-in bench. Only now there was a page pinned to one of the posts with a chunk of rusted metal. It was my notebook page, same one I'd torn out and stuck in my pocket. I reached for it. My pocket was empty. The message was the same, Trace 9, you came back. But there was a second line now, scrawled underneath it, stop repeating. I left the page. I didn't take a picture, didn't tear it out again. I walked straight down the slope behind the clearing, pushing through brush, branches smacking my arms, thorns catching my sleeves. I didn't care. I didn't stop. After maybe 45 minutes of bushwhacking, I caught a glint of sunlight on metal, Nolan's RV. I pushed through the last stand of trees, scratched up and breathless. He was sitting in a folding chair, scrolling his phone. Looked up, blinked at me like nothing was weird. Said I'd been gone 40 minutes. My watch said nearly 4 hours had passed. I didn't say anything, just dropped onto the RV step and drank a full bottle of Gatorade in about 30 seconds. Later, I checked my phone again. The GPS app wasn't open, but there was a notification. Trace 9 starts. Still blinking red. I deleted the app. Then I burned the notebook. Tossed the whole thing into the fire pit and washed it black and page by page. Nolan thought I was having heat stroke. Maybe I was. We packed up and left that night instead of staying another day.